Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Biographer, where curiosity gets cozy and history takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight's gentle journey is all about Jesus Christ, the quiet child from a humble village whose words and presence would ripple across centuries like soft circles in a still pond. But before we unravel the winding footpaths of his life, the ones that lead through dusty markets, moonlit hillsides, and whispered prayers, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Perhaps it's morning, where you are, and the thought of a sunrise over Galilee feels near. Or maybe it's late at night and the stillness carries you to the shores of a silent lake under the same moon he once saw. If you find this voyage soothing, intriguing, or just a nice way to unwind after a long day, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm reach others who might need a peaceful pause too. Now, I do hope this isn't so fascinating that it keeps you awake, but if it does, well, at least you'll have learned something about how a single life can change the rhythm of the whole world before you drift off. So settle in, slow your thoughts, and let's begin, because history is about to place a gentle lantern in our hands and guide us down a path 2,000 years old. The world into which Jesus was born was not quiet, though his beginnings were marked by quiet places. The land of Judea lay under the vast and disciplined reach of the Roman Empire, its roads long and well-worn, its rule firm and sometimes unyielding. Yet beneath this political order, there pulsed a restless hope, an ancient promise kept alive in the hearts of the Jewish people, a promise of a Messiah, a figure who would bring freedom and peace, and perhaps more than anything, a sense that God was nearer than the air they breathed. Life in the small towns of Galilee and Judea followed patterns that had been shaped over generations. The scent of fresh bread baking in clay ovens, the bleating of goats in early morning, the call to prayer from the synagogue mingling with the chatter of markets. It was a world of sandals on stone, water drawn from deep wells, and stories passed down under the shade of olive trees for many. It was a life defined by labor seasons of planting and harvest, but also by rhythms of faith and holy days. In Bethlehem, a town whose name meant house of bread, a young woman named Mary found herself at the center of an unfolding mystery. She was betrothed to Joseph, a carpenter from Nazareth, and together they would soon begin a journey that would be remembered far beyond the boundaries of their lives. We'll walk beside them gently and slowly, seeing the world as they saw it, and feeling the weight of each step toward a stable where history and heaven seemed to meet in the quiet breath of a newborn child. The night in Bethlehem was not silent in the way we sometimes imagine. It was alive with the quiet hum of a small town filled to its edges. Travelers finding what rest they could in corners and courtyards. A census had drawn them all here. The emperor far away in Rome had ordered it, and so the roads were lined for days with families carrying their belongings on backs, shoulders, and weary animals. Mary and Joseph were among them, moving step by step over hills and through valleys. Joseph steady and watchful, Mary carrying more than the weight of travel. She carried the slow rhythm of new life. The air in Bethlehem was cool under a sky scattered with stars, the kind of clear night that makes you feel the dome of the heavens stretching forever above. The streets were narrow, lined with stone walls that held the day's heat and gave it back in soft waves as night fell. Every guest room was taken, crowded with voices of men trading stories and the sounds of children trying to sleep. Joseph knocked at door after door, but found the same reply: no room, no space. Yet space can be found in the most unlikely places. And so they were guided to a stable, a place meant for animals. But on that night it became something more. The scent of hay hung in the air, mingled with the earthy warmth of sheep and oxen. A lantern's flame cast gentle shadows across the rough wood beams. Mary rested on a bed of straw. The stable doors opened to the night air as the hours turned slowly toward dawn. It was here that Jesus entered the world, without the robes of kings or the halls of palaces, but with the quiet company of creatures who breathe softly in the dark. Mary wrapped him in swaddling cloths, the fabric worn smooth by many washings, and laid him in a manger, its rough edges softened by the straw beneath his tiny form. His first cries were not loud. They were the kind of sound that makes those nearby lean closer to listen. In the hills nearby, shepherds kept watch over their flocks. The grass damp with dew, the stars bright enough to see the folds of the land they were used to, long hours, and the soft shifting of sheep. But this night was different. A sudden light broke the darkness. Not the flicker of a torch, but a brightness that seemed to come from the very sky. The shepherds shielded their eyes and then heard a voice, calm, yet filled with something they could not name. "Do not be afraid, for I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all people today. In the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is Christ, the Lord." And then the sky was filled with sound, as though every note of joy that had ever been waited for was released in that single moment. The voices like rushing water and soft wind at once. "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace, to those on whom his favor rests." When the light faded, the shepherds looked at each other with wonder, and without hesitation they left their flocks behind and hurried to Bethlehem, their steps quick, their hearts racing. They found the stable just as they had been told, a young woman with eyes that held both weariness and peace. A man who stood close by, one hand resting on the manger, and in it, the child. The shepherds knelt, not because anyone told them to, but because something deep within whispered that this moment was holy. They told Mary and Joseph all they had seen and heard, and Mary kept those words in her heart, turning them over like treasures she could not yet fully understand. Outside Bethlehem, the world went on. Travelers slept under the same stars, merchants closed their shops, the Roman guard kept their watch. And yet in this small place, in the quiet hours before dawn, something had begun, a light not easily put out, a story that would travel farther than any road the empire had ever built. After the night in Bethlehem, the days unfolded quietly, as if the world itself were taking slow, careful steps around this new life. Joseph and Mary tended to their child with the steady rhythm of ordinary care. Swaddling, feeding, soothing, rocking. The stable had been just the beginning. Soon they would find shelter in a proper home and make ready for travel when word reached them that danger was near. For even in the first chapters of his life, Jesus would know the shadow of kings. Herod, troubled by the news of a possible rival, sent out orders that placed every young child in peril. Guided by a dream, Joseph took Mary and the infant, and under the cover of night they left for Egypt. The road was long, a ribbon of dust, stretching between rocky hills and the wide open spaces of the desert. Mary held Jesus close against her as the wind carried scents of dry earth and distant water. Wells along the way provided not only drink, but brief moments of rest. Voices of strangers speaking languages they half understood, and the kindness of those who shared bread without asking. They stayed in Egypt until the danger had passed, and Herod was gone, and then returned to the land they called home. But instead of Bethlehem, they went north to Nazareth, a small town tucked among the hills. Galilee was a place of olive groves and vineyards, where the seasons could be read in the tilt of the sun and the rustle of leaves. Nazareth had no grand streets or marble buildings, just simple homes built of stone, narrow lanes where neighbors knew each other's names, and the smell of wood shavings from carpenters' workshops floated through the air. It was here that Jesus grew, surrounded by the patterns of village life. Mornings often began with the sound of roosters calling across the rooftops, women carrying jars to the well, children playing in the dust until called to their chores. Joseph worked with wood, shaping beams for houses, yokes for oxen, tables for family meals. And in time, Jesus would learn the same craft, his hands small at first, tracing the grain of the timber, watching the curl of shavings fall to the ground. Mary taught him the prayers of their people, songs that had been sung for generations, and the stories of Abraham, Moses, David, stories that would later flow from his own lips, in ways that would surprise those who heard them. In the synagogue, he learned to listen to the readings from the Torah, scroll unrolled carefully by the elders, the words spoken slowly with reverence. These were years not marked by miracles or large crowds, but by steady growth and quiet observation. Jesus walked the hills around Nazareth, feeling the crunch of dry grass under his sandals and the warmth of the sun on his shoulders. He learned the faces of the market sellers, the taste of figs in season, and the way storms would gather suddenly over the Sea of Galilee. Even from far away, he saw how neighbors helped one another in times of sickness or loss. and how disputes could be mended over shared bread. Perhaps it was here in these hidden years that he gathered not just knowledge, but understanding, the kind that comes from living close to the earth and close to people, from noticing the smallest kindnesses and the sharpest sorrows, from seeing how the poorest still found reason to sing, wealthiest still searched for something they could not name. The scriptures tell us little of these years, leaving room for the mind to wander, to picture him as a boy running along the narrow lanes, as a youth working beside his father, as a young man quietly carrying in his heart a sense of timing that would not be hurried. For now, it was enough to be part of the life around him, to grow in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man, as the seasons turned over and over, like the wheels of a cart on a long familiar road. In Nazareth, life moved forward, but somewhere beyond its hills the world was slowly turning toward the moment when this quiet carpenter's son would step into the open and begin to speak words that would change the air itself. The Jordan River wound its way through the land like a green ribbon, a place where reeds swayed in the breeze, and the water carried the scent of far-off springs for many. It was simply a source of life, watering fields and quenching thirst. But in the days when Jesus was a grown man, still unknown to the crowds, it became a place where something new was stirring. A voice had risen in the wilderness, a voice that called people out of their homes and into the open air. The man was John, known to many as the Baptist, and his presence was as striking as his words. John's clothing was simple, woven from camel hair bound at the waist with a leather belt. His food was wild honey and locusts, a diet of the desert. His eyes seemed to see straight through to the heart, and his voice carried over the murmur of the river, telling the people to turn back to God, to wash away the dust of their wrongdoings and begin again. He spoke not from the comfort of the temple, but from the banks of the Jordan, where the water flowed steady and unpolished, where anyone could come. Word of John spread quickly, drawing fishermen, farmers, merchants, even soldiers. They came not only to hear him, but to step into the river themselves, to feel the cool water close over them and rise up with the sunlight in their eyes. John spoke of one who was coming, one greater than he, whose sandals he was not worthy to untie, a figure whose presence would be like a refining fire and a gentle rain all at once. Jesus left Nazareth to seek him. The road to the Jordan took him past fields where workers bent to the harvest, and through valleys that echoed with the call of birds. He walked without hurry, letting each step bring him closer to the sound of water. When at last he reached the river, he saw the line of people wading in and out. John standing in the shallows, his hands lifting water in blessing. When Jesus stepped forward, John looked at him with recognition, not of face alone but of spirit. He hesitated, saying, it should be the other way around, that Jesus should be the one baptizing him. But Jesus answered quietly, let it be so. Now, for it is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness. And so they waded together into the deeper part of the river, the water swirling around their knees, then their waists. John placed his hands on Jesus and lowered him into the Jordan. The water closed over him, cool and weightless, and then he rose again, the sun catching the droplets on his hair and face. And in that moment, the air itself seemed to shift. The sky opened, and a light unlike any other poured down. A voice came not from the banks or the crowd, but from above. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. And a dove descended, gentle and unafraid, settling near him, as if to seal what had been spoken. The people stood silent, caught between wonder and the sense that they had witnessed something they could not fully explain. Jesus left the river without fanfare, walking back toward the hills, the water drying on his skin, each step leading not back to the quiet of Nazareth, but toward the wide unknown of his public life. John watched him go, knowing his own role was to prepare the way, to point toward the one now moving out of sight. But never from the center of the story the Jordan returned to its steady flow, carrying away the ripples of that morning, yet holding in its depths the memory of a moment when the heavens had opened and the world had been gently told to listen. After the waters of the Jordan closed and opened again over him, Jesus did not return to the villages or seek the company of the crowds. Instead, he turned toward the wilderness, that wide and ancient space, where the land itself seemed to listen. More than speak, the hills rolled in muted shades of brown and gold, The wind carried the dry scent of stone and sage, and the horizon stretched so far that days could pass without the sound of another human voice. It was here that he would spend 40 days and 40 nights, a span of time, both long and strangely short when measured by the heart. There was no shelter, but the caves hollowed into the hillsides. No music but the low hum of wind through the rocks and the call of distant birds. Each morning began with the pale light of sunrise spilling over the ridges. Each night ended under skies crowded with stars, so bright they seemed close, enough to touch here, away from the noise and the familiar. Jesus fasted, his body growing lighter, his mind sharper yet quieter. He prayed, he listened, he let the silence speak. But the wilderness is not empty. It holds not only the beauty of stillness, but also the weight of testing. As the days wore on, the tempter came not as a storm but as a voice weaving into the quiet, offering shortcuts to what Jesus had come to do. "If you are the Son of God," the voice said, "tell the stones to become bread." The hunger in his body was real, sharp as the edge of flint. But Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the scene shifted. In the mind's eye, the voice set him high on the temple's pinnacle, looking down at the streets far below. "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you. They will lift you up, so you will not strike your foot against stone." It was a challenge, to prove, to dazzle, to demand a sign. But Jesus replied, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Once more the voice changed, the view carrying him to a high mountain, where the kingdoms of the world lay spread like a tapestry, all their splendor within reach, all their crowns for the taking. "If only you will bow down and worship me, all this will be yours." It was an offer of power without the path of sacrifice. But Jesus said, "Away from me, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." And then it was over. The air seemed lighter, the silence gentler, the voice gone. The tempter had left, and in his place came angels, not with blinding light, but with the simple comfort of presence. They tended to him in ways unseen, perhaps in food, perhaps in strength, perhaps only in the deep sense that he was not alone. When the 40 days ended, Jesus stepped out of the wilderness, the sun warming his face, the road before him, leading back toward the villages where people worked and traded and told stories. At day's end, he carried with him the quiet strength that comes from meeting the hardest questions in the loneliest places, and answering them not with haste but with the steady truth he had known all along. The hills faded behind him, but the lessons of their stillness would stay in his steps wherever he went. When Jesus left the wilderness, the road carried him back toward the waters of Galilee, where the air held the scent of fishnets drying in the sun, and the cries of gulls followed the shore. The towns along the lake lived by the rhythm of the water boats pushing out at dawn, nets cast wide into the deep and drawn back in heavy or light, depending on the day. It was here, among these fishermen and market sellers, that Jesus began to gather those who would walk beside him. One morning the light was just beginning to spill over the hills, painting the water with gold. Jesus stood on the shore watching two brothers cast their net into the lake, their movements practiced and sure. Simon called Peter, and Andrew, his brother. They worked in steady silence, their eyes on water. Jesus called out, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." The words seemed to settle in the air with a weight they could not ignore. They looked at one another, then left their nets still wet on the shore and walked toward him. Further along the water's edge, two more brothers, James and John, were in a boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets. The smell of tar and rope thick in the air. Jesus called them too, and without pause they stepped out of the boat, leaving their father to watch them go. The decision was explained, not debated. Something in the call itself carried its own reason. As the days passed, the circle grew. Philip from Bethsaida, who quickly sought out his friend Nathanael, telling him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about, and the prophets too." Nathanael, skeptical at first, asked, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Philip simply replied, "Come and see." And when Nathanael met Jesus, the doubt seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet sense of being known before a word was spoken. These first companions were not scholars or officials. They were men of the shore and the market, accustomed to hard work and simple talk, yet each carried within them a readiness. They might not have known. They had Jesus spoke to them, not of titles or positions, but of walking with him, learning from him, sharing in the work of bringing good news to those who needed it most. Together they traveled from village to village, the disciples listening as Jesus spoke to small gatherings in courtyards or under the shade of fig trees, his words painting pictures of seeds growing unseen in the soil of shepherds. Leaving the 99 to seek the one lost sheep of lamps placed high, to give light to all in the house, they watched as people came to him with their burdens, both spoken and silent, and left with lighter steps. In the evenings, when the crowds thinned, they sat together by small fires. The smell of the day's catch roasting over the coals, the lake dark and still under the stars. Jesus would speak quietly, sometimes telling stories, sometimes letting the silence stretch between them. They were learning not just by hearing, but by watching, by sharing the road, by seeing how he treated the stranger and the friend alike. There was no grand announcement that these men were now disciples, no formal ceremony, just the slow weaving of their lives into his days until their steps matched his, and their questions began to open into understanding. They could not yet see the full shape of where this road would lead. Only each day began with the same choice to walk alongside the one who had called them from their nets and into a story far greater than they had imagined. The road to Cana wound through gentle hills, where vineyards stretched in ordered rows, and the air held the faint sweetness of ripening grapes. The village itself was small, built of stone homes, clustered close together with narrow streets that opened into a central courtyard. It was here that a wedding was taking place. The kind of celebration that gathered not only family but neighbors and friends from surrounding towns. Music drifted from the open doorways, and the sound of laughter mingled with the rhythm of hand drums and the bright notes of flutes. Mary was among the guests, and so was Jesus. Along with some of his new disciples, they had come not to teach or to heal, but simply to share in the joy of the occasion. The tables were set with bread, olives and figs, platters of roasted lamb and bowls of fragrant herbs. Pitchers of wine stood ready to fill the clay cups that passed from hand to hand. It was the kind of feast where stories were told and retold, where the clink of cups was as steady as the music. Yet behind the scenes a quiet problem was unfolding. The wine had run out. Perhaps more guests had come than expected. Perhaps the planning had been too modest for such a lively crowd. In any case, the moment was awkward for the hosts in a culture where hospitality was a deep measure of honor. Noticed and turned to her son, telling him simply, "They have no more wine." Jesus replied, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." But Mary seemed to understand something. Beyond the words she told the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 large stone jars used for ceremonial washing, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. The jars were empty, their stone sides cool to the touch. Jesus told the servants, "Fill the jars with water." They obeyed, filling them to the brim. The sound of water pouring echoing in the quiet space between songs. Then he said, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." The servants again obeyed. When the master tasted the water that had become wine, he did not know where it had come from. But the servants knew. His eyes widened, and he called the bridegroom aside, saying, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine, after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." No one announced what had happened. There was no sudden hush, no dramatic turning of heads. The music went on. The laughter continued. Yet in that small hidden way, the first of Jesus' signs had taken place, and his disciples who saw it felt their trust in him deepen, like roots finding water. The wine was rich and full, its taste a quiet marvel to those who knew the truth. The jars stood where they had always stood, but now held something far beyond their ordinary use. The miracle was not about spectacle, but about kindness meeting a need without drawing attention to the giver. As the evening wore on, the stars brightened over Cana, the air cooling as guests lingered in the courtyard. Jesus moved among them as any other guest. Yet those closest to him carried the quiet knowledge that something extraordinary had unfolded in the midst of the ordinary, and that perhaps this was how his work would often be: signs hidden in plain sight, moments that changed everything, while most simply went on celebrating unaware. The road from Cana would lead to many other towns and many other moments, but for the disciples, this day remained a soft light in their memory. The day when water became wine and the everyday became a doorway to the divine. The region of Galilee was a patchwork of hills and valleys dotted with small towns, each with its own market, its own synagogue, and the hum of daily life. The lake lay at the heart of it all, shimmering in the sunlight, like a piece of the sky laid gently on the earth. Jesus walked these roads, often his steps slow enough to notice the wildflowers along the path, the way the light shifted on the water, and the faces of the people who paused in their work to listen. In one town he stood in the synagogue, the scroll of the prophet Isaiah unrolled in his hands, the air still as he read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." When he finished, he rolled up the scroll, handed it back, and sat down, every eye fixed on him as he said, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." His voice was steady, but his words stirred something deep in those who listened. In the open fields, his teaching was different. The crowd sat on the grass, their children chasing each other at the edges, while the older ones leaned forward to catch each word. Jesus spoke of the kingdom of heaven, not as a distant, unreachable place, but as a seed planted in the ground, so small, first you could miss it, yet growing into something large enough for birds to rest in its branches. He spoke of a lamp placed on a stand, so its light could fill the whole room, and of salt that gives flavor to everything it touches. The parables were simple, yet layered, each one a small door into a larger room. The people nodded at the familiar images, but found themselves thinking long after the words had been spoken. Some smiled in sudden understanding, others frowned, puzzled, but intrigued. His teaching was not about telling people what to think, but inviting them to see the world in a new way, to notice the hidden patterns of grace in the ordinary. In Galilee he taught not only with words but with presence, stopping to greet the elderly who sat in the shade, listening to children's questions with the same attention. He gave to scholars, accepting the hospitality of fishermen and farmers alike. At the marketplace he spoke to a tax collector named Matthew sitting at his booth. The coins laid out before him, "Follow me," and without hesitation, Matthew rose and joined him. Some days the teaching was done from a boat pushed out a little from shore so the crowd could gather along the beach, the water carrying his voice easily to those who sat on the sand. The lake reflected the sky, and the sound of waves lapping at the boat seemed to mark the rhythm of his words. "Are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the peacemakers." In Galilee the news of his words began to spread, carried from town to town by those who had heard him, or had friends who had heard him. And with the news came questions. Who is this man that speaks with such authority, yet without the harshness of the lawgivers, who heals without payment, who sits at the table with those others avoid? Some came out of curiosity, some in hope, some with skepticism, yet all found themselves drawn to the quiet strength in his voice. The hills of Galilee kept their gentle green and the lake its endless shimmer, but for those who listened, the landscape itself seemed different. Now, as if the very fields might be holding a story, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The towns along the shores of Galilee began to speak of Jesus, not only as a teacher, but as one who healed the sick. Word spread quickly in places where illness could change a family's life in an instant, and where the cost of medicine or the skill of a physician was often beyond reach. Some spoke in whispers, as though to protect the fragile hope his presence brought. Others called out openly, urging friends or relatives to come and see for themselves. One day a man with leprosy approached, while others stepped back. The disease not only marked the body, but pushed a person to the edges of society, far from touch, far from shared meals, far from the comfort of a neighbor's hand. The man knelt before Jesus and said, "If you are willing, you can make clean." Jesus reached out without hesitation and touched him. The touch came first before the words "I am willing, be clean," and the man's skin was restored smooth and whole. In another town, the sound of many voices filled the air, a crowd pressing close around a house. Where Jesus was speaking, 4 friends arrived carrying a man on a mat. Unable to walk, the door was blocked by the sheer number of people. So they climbed to the roof, pulled away the thatch, and lowered him down into the room below. Jesus looked at their faith as much as the man before him, saying, "Your sins are forgiven," and then "Rise, pick up your mat, and walk." The man stood, the mat now folded under his arm, the crowd parting to let him through. By the roadside outside Jericho, a blind man sat wrapped in his cloak, listening to the footsteps of passers-by. When he heard that Jesus was near, he began to call out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Though some tried to quiet him, he called louder. Jesus stopped and asked, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord, I want to see." The answer was simple. The result, immediate. The man's eyes opened to the light and color of the day, and he followed along the road, his voice now filled with praise. There were times when the healing was as much about the heart as the body. A woman who had suffered for 12 years from bleeding came up behind him in a crowd, her fingers brushing the edge of his cloak. She thought, "If I only touch his garment, I will be healed." Jesus felt the moment turned and said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has healed you." And she knew the burden she had carried so long was gone. Even in the smallest villages, Jesus noticed the ones others passed by, the children who ran to him with open hands, the widows whose lives had grown quiet after loss, the laborers weary from fields and nets. His compassion was not hurried. It had the patience of someone who saw each person not as part of a crowd, but as an individual with a story worth hearing. The healings were not simply acts of power. They were signs that the kingdom he spoke of was not distant, but present, breaking into the ordinary day with moments of restoration. The sick could stand again, the blind could see, the outcasts could come home to their families. In these moments, the people caught a glimpse of what life could be, whole and unbroken. And yet he often told those healed to speak of it quietly, as if the miracle itself was meant to point not to the healer but to the greater work unfolding through him. Still, the news traveled, because joy is hard to keep contained, and so more came, carrying their hopes on their backs, in their arms, in the silent prayers they barely dared to voice. The Sea of Galilee was a place of shifting moods, sometimes calm as glass, reflecting the pale blush of dawn, sometimes restless with waves that slapped against the sides of fishing boats. Without warning, the wind could sweep down from the surrounding hills, turning the water into a churning grey and sending even experienced fishermen to tighten their grip on the oars. One evening, after a long day of teaching, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." They pushed the boat from shore, the sky deepening into the blues of night as they rowed away from the lights of the villages. The steady dip of oars, the gentle creak of wood keeping time with the soft lap of water against the hull. Jesus found a place at the stern and soon slept, his head resting on a cushion, the rhythms of the lake lulling him into rest. Then the wind began to rise, first as a whisper, then as a voice that grew louder. The waves lifted and fell more sharply, water splashing into the boat. The disciples' easy conversation turning to short, urgent commands. They knew the sea, they knew its dangers, but still the storm pressed harder. Rain stung their faces. The sky split with flashes of light, and still Jesus slept. At last, they shook him awake. "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Their voices carried both fear and disbelief. He rose, not with haste, but with a calm that seemed untouched by the chaos around them. He spoke to the wind and the waves, quiet, "Be still," and just as quickly as it had risen, the storm eased. The wind fell, the water smoothed, the boat rocked gently as though nothing had happened. The disciples sat in the sudden stillness, the sound of their own breathing loud in their ears. "Who is this?" they asked. Each other. Even the wind and the waves obey him. The question lingered heavier than the storm itself, for they had seen healings and heard teachings, but here was authority over the very elements of the earth. Another time a storm came without him. In the boat he had sent the disciples ahead, while he stayed to pray on the hillside. Night fell, and the wind picked up, pushing against their progress. The waves rising high, their muscles straining against the oars. Then in the darkest part of the night, they saw a figure walking toward them across the water. Fear rose quickly. "It is a ghost," they cried out, but his voice came steady and clear. "Take courage, it is. Don't be afraid." Peter called back, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," Jesus said, and Peter stepped out his feet, finding the surface firm enough to hold each step. His eyes fixed on Jesus, but the wind still moved around him. The waves still rose, and when his gaze shifted to them, his footing faltered. He began to sink. "Lord, save me," he cried. And at once, Jesus reached out his hand, pulling him up. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Together they stepped into the boat, and the wind fell away. In these moments on the lake, the disciples learned something beyond the skill of steering through storms. They learned that stillness was not only the absence of wind, but the presence of trust. That peace could come, not from the water's calm surface, but from the voice that could speak into chaos, make it quiet again. And that voice was with them, whether the boat was filled with sunlight or tossed in the darkest hour before dawn. As Jesus travels through Galilee and beyond, continued, the crowds grew larger. Sometimes so many gathered that he had to speak from a boat or from the slope of a hill, so that all could hear. Yet, even with the growing number of followers, there was a smaller circle, those he called more closely to himself to walk with him in every step of his work. From this circle, he chose 12, each different in background and temperament, yet bound together by the call they had answered. There was Simon, whom Jesus called Peter the Rock, though his nature was anything but unshakable at first. Quick to speak, quick to act, often bold, yet also capable of deep loyalty. His brother Andrew, quieter, more measured, the one who had first heard John the Baptist, and then brought Peter to Jesus. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, fishermen, with strong arms and a strong will, nicknamed Sons of Thunder, perhaps for their fiery energy. Philip, practical and earnest, often the one to think about the details before taking a step. There was Bartholomew, sometimes called Nathanael, a man without deceit as Jesus described him, one who spoke plainly. Matthew the tax collector, once seated behind the heavy coins and ledgers of his booth, now walking roads far from that life. Thomas, the one who would later be remembered for his questions, but whose willingness to face danger was no less real. James, son of Alphaeus, a quieter figure in the records, his life perhaps marked more by steady faith than by public words. Thaddeus, also known as Judas, son of James, remembered for his questions about how Jesus would reveal himself to the world. Simon the Zealot, whose earlier life may have been marked by political fervor, now tempered by the path he walked. And Judas Iscariot, the one who would carry the common purse, whose presence, even in these early days, carried a shadow none could yet name. Jesus called them not because they were alike or flawless, but because each brought something to the work ahead. Their differences a kind of mosaic that reflected the many faces of those they would meet. Some knew the scriptures well, others knew the rhythm of labor and trade. Some were cautious, impulsive, some held strong opinions, others watched and listened more than they spoke. Together they traveled, shared meals under the open sky, took shelter where they were welcomed, and slept where they could. They learned not only from Jesus' words, but from the way he moved through the world, pausing to notice the unseen, answering interruptions with patience, facing opposition with calm authority. They did not yet fully understand. He sent them out in pairs to towns he himself would later visit, telling them to take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, to stay in the first house that welcomed them, and to leave a blessing behind even if the town did not receive them. This was as much lesson in trust as it was in proclamation. They returned with stories of hospitality and of hearts opened, and they began to see that the work was not theirs alone, but a sharing in something greater. Around the fire at night, their conversations ranged from the simple needs of the day to the mysteries of the kingdom. Jesus spoke to them more plainly than to the crowds, explaining parables, answering their questions, and sometimes asking his own. Their lives were becoming woven into his, not just as students, but as friends, companions who would be with him in joy and in trial. They could not yet see the road that would test each bond or the choices that would one day scatter them. For now, there was the shared journey, the laughter of the group after a long day, the sound of sandals on the dusty road, and the growing sense that they were part of a story whose full weight they would only understand much later. As Jesus moved from town to town, his words and actions drew not only the curious and the hopeful, but also the watchful eyes of those who guarded the traditions of the faith. The scribes and Pharisees, men well versed in the law, their lives shaped by the careful keeping of commands, their authority rested on their role as interpreters and guardians of what had been handed down for generations. And so when Jesus spoke with an authority that did not lean on their approval, or when he healed in ways that crossed their boundaries, it stirred a quiet unease that soon became open challenge. One Sabbath day, Jesus and his disciples walked through grain fields, the heads of grain ripe and golden under the sun. As they went, the disciples began to pick some of the heads, rubbing them in their hands to eat. The Pharisees, who saw, said, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread which was lawful only for priests to eat. Then he said, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath,' his voice steady, not in defiance but in the certainty of truth." Another Sabbath found him in the synagogue where a man's hand was withered. The eyes of the leaders were fixed on him, to see if he would heal on the holy day. Jesus called the man to stand in front of everyone, then asked, "Is it lawful to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it?" Silence met his question. He told the man, "Stretch out your hand," and as he did it was restored whole as the other. The joy of the man's face contrasted sharply with the tight-lipped disapproval of those who saw their control slipping. Jesus did not seek quarrel for its own sake, yet he would not let tradition be used to close the door on compassion. His teaching often unwrapped the heart of the law, showing that it was not meant as a heavy burden, but as a guide toward love of God and neighbor. He spoke of mercy over sacrifice, of the weightier matters of justice, faithfulness, and compassion. And in doing so, he invited the people to step beyond fear into freedom. There were also moments in the temple courts where the confrontation grew sharper, when Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, the coins scattering across the stones and the doves fluttering in startled bursts. He said, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." The air in that moment was thick with the clash between the way things were and the way they ought to be. Yet even in disagreement, he sometimes shared quiet conversations with those from among the leaders who were willing to listen. Nicodemus came to him at night away from the watching eyes and asked about the kingdom of God. Jesus spoke to him of being born again, not in the flesh but in the spirit, planting seeds of understanding that would grow over time. The tension between Jesus and the authorities was not only about law, but about the kind of kingdom he described, a kingdom that welcomed the poor, the outcast, and the sinner as readily as the learned and the devout. It loosened the grip of fear and control and replaced it with the open hands of grace. To those whose authority rested on rigid structures, such openness was unsettling. Still, he walked into their synagogues, their marketplaces, their temple courts, never turning away from the questions, never avoiding the eyes that measured his every move. His path was not one of avoidance, but of steady truth, spoken in the midst of both welcome and resistance. And each step forward drew the lines of the coming days a little clearer. The day had begun with the quiet hope of rest. Jesus and his disciples had crossed the lake, seeking a place apart from the constant press of the crowds. But the people saw where they were going and followed on foot, moving along the shoreline in a long, steady stream by the time the boat reached the other side. A vast crowd had already gathered, waiting for him. There was no sigh of frustration in his voice, no turning them away. Instead, he welcomed them, speaking of the kingdom and healing those in need. The hours slipped by under the wide sky, the disciples watching as the crowd swelled into the thousands, men, women, children, scattered across the hillside, the sun sinking lower with each passing moment. At last, the disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already getting late. Send the people away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves something to eat." Jesus looked at them and said, "You give them something to eat." They glanced at one another. the cost alone enough to make it seem impossible. Then Andrew spoke up. "There is a boy here with 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down. The grass was soft beneath them, the air cooling as evening drew in. He took the loaves and fish, looked up to heaven, thanks the simple food cradled in his hands. Then he broke the loaves and handed them to the disciples, who began to pass them among the people. At first it seemed the bread would be gone too soon, yet as they moved from group to group there was always more. The fish passed from hand to hand, the loaves broken and shared until everyone had eaten their fill. Laughter rose from the children, crumbs clung to the fingers of the men who had thought themselves too hungry to smile. Before now the hillside hummed with the easy talk of people satisfied. When it was done, Jesus told them to gather the pieces that were left over. Let nothing be wasted. The disciples moved among the groups, collecting basket after basket until 12 were filled, more than had been there at the start. The people looked at one another, amazed at what they had seen and tasted. Some began to murmur about making Jesus king, their voices carrying the heat of sudden enthusiasm. But Jesus withdrew quietly to the hills alone. This was not the only time such a meal unfolded. Later, in a more remote place with fewer loaves and fish, and yet again thousands were fed. The pattern repeating, the offering of what little there was, the giving of thanks, the breaking and the sharing, each time revealing the same truth, that in his hands scarcity became abundance, and what seemed too small was enough for all. For the disciples these moments were lessons lived out, not in words alone, but in the weight of bread in their hands, and the look on the faces of those they served. They learned that the kingdom was not only about the healing of bodies or the opening of eyes, but also about the filling of empty places, the meeting of need without counting the cost. Long after the crowds had gone home and the baskets had been set aside, the memory of that hillside stayed with them, the green grass, the lake shimmering in the distance, the scent of bread carried on the evening breeze, and the quiet certainty that in the presence of Jesus there was always enough. Evening had settled over the lake, the last light fading behind the hills. As the disciples prepared to cross to the other side, the air was cool, the surface of the water darkening into ripples that caught what remained of the sky. Jesus had stayed behind to pray alone on the hillside, his figure growing small against the rocks as they pushed the boat from shore, the oars dipping in a steady rhythm, the quiet of the early night holding around them. But as the hours passed, the wind began to rise, first as a shiver across the water, then as a steady push against their progress. The waves lifted and fell harder, the muscles in their arms tightening with each pull of the oars. The moonlight slipped behind clouds, until the night seemed to press close around them, their voices low and quick over the sound of the wind. It was sometime between the deep hours of night and the first hint of dawn when they saw a figure moving across the water. At first, it was only a shape against the shifting dark, and they cried out in fear, "It is a ghost." But then came the voice clear against the wind, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." The sound of it familiar, steady enough to cut through the storm. Peter called back, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," Jesus said, and Peter stepped over the side of the boat, the cold shock of the lake rising to meet his feet, and yet he stood, his eyes fixed on Jesus. He took one step, then another, the water firm underfoot as long as his gaze held steady, but the wind still roared around him. The waves still rose, and when he turned his attention to them, his footing faltered. He began to sink, crying out, "Lord, save me at once." Jesus reached out his hand, pulling him up. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Together they stepped back into the boat, and the wind fell, the waves smoothing into gentle swells as if the storm had never been. The disciples sat in the sudden stillness, the water rocking them softly, their hearts still pounding. Those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The night air felt different now, less heavy, the horizon beginning to pale with the first touch of morning. For the disciples, the memory of that night became more than a story about wind and waves. It was a reminder that faith was not about the absence of fear, but about where they turned when fear came. It was about stepping onto uncertain ground or uncertain water, because his voice had called them finding that even when the footing gave way, his hand was there. Later, when they would again face storms of a different kind, the kind that rose from crowds or councils or their own doubts, perhaps they would remember the weight of water beneath their feet, the reach of his hand in the dark and the quiet after the wind had ceased. When the only sound was the soft slap of waves against the side of the boat carrying them toward the shore, there came a day when Jesus took 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, and led them up a high mountain apart from the others. The climb was steady, the path narrowing as it wound upward, the air cooling with each step until the sounds of the valleys below grew faint. The hillside gave way to rocky slopes and open sky where the light felt clearer, more alive. They reached a quiet place near the summit, the view stretching in every direction, hills folding into hills. The faint shimmer of distant water. The disciples settled their breath, expecting perhaps a time of prayer, as they had known before. But then something unlike anything they had seen unfold before their eyes. Jesus stood before them, and the light around him changed. It was not the warm gold of afternoon, nor the silver wash of moonlight, but something purer. His face shone like the sun. His clothing became dazzling white, as if woven from light itself. The air seemed to hold its breath in that moment, and then they saw that he was not alone. 2 figures stood with him, speaking together in low tones that carried across the stillness. Somehow they knew it was Moses, the giver of the law, and Elijah, the prophet of fire, standing in conversation with him. Peter, always quick to speak, felt the urge to hold on to the moment. "Lord, it is good for us to be here," he said. "If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But even as he spoke, a bright cloud enveloped them, and from the cloud came a voice, clear and steady. "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." The sound was both near and far, filling the air and sinking into their hearts. The disciples fell to the ground, faces pressed against the rocky earth, fear and awe mingling in them. Until Jesus came near, touched them, and said, "Rise, do not be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one but him. The light returned to its familiar warmth, the cloud gone, the mountain as it had been, yet nothing felt the same. As they made their way down the path, winding back toward the world below, Jesus told them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had been raised from the dead. The words puzzled them. They carried both wonder and questions in their silence. The image of that shining moment imprinted deep within them. The mountain would remain in their memory, not only for the light they had seen, but for the sense that heaven and earth had drawn close together, that the law and the prophets had met in quiet conversation with the one they followed, and that the voice from the cloud had given them not a command to act but to listen. In the days that followed, when the path grew more crowded with opposition, when the air felt heavy with things they could not yet name, perhaps they would remember the brightness on the mountain, the stillness in the cloud, and the hand that touched them, lifting them back to their feet, and in memory find again the courage to keep walking. The roads of Galilee and Judea often became open-air classrooms where Jesus spoke of the kingdom of heaven, not as a distant prize reserved for the few, but as a living reality already unfolding in small and hidden ways. He drew his images from the world around them so that anyone listening could see in their mind what he described: a mustard seed barely visible between the fingers, yet growing into a tree where birds found rest. Yeast worked quietly into dough until it rose and filled the house with the scent of bread, a pearl of great price for which a merchant sold everything to possess. He spoke of the kingdom as a treasure hidden in a field, a man finding it and in joy selling all he had to buy. That field, to those listening, the message was clear. The kingdom was worth everything, yet it could be missed if one was not paying attention. It was not about grand displays or the approval of the powerful, but about a transformation that began deep within and spread out. The crowds heard these parables with varying hearts. Some nodded with understanding, others frowned in thought, still others turned away, puzzled by words that seemed too simple to hold such weight. The disciples often asked him afterward to explain, and he did, showing them that the seed was the word planted in hearts, the soil, its readiness to receive the sower's patience, the mark of the kingdom's quiet work. He also spoke of forgiveness as central to this kingdom, not as a suggestion, but as a way of life, telling them to forgive 70 times 7. not keeping count, but making forgiveness as constant as breathing. He told the story of a servant forgiven a great debt who refused to forgive a smaller one, warning that the kingdom could not take root in a heart that clung to resentment. Children often found their way into these gatherings, their laughter and small footsteps moving freely among the adults. When some tried to send them away, Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." He placed his hands on their heads and blessed them, showing that the kingdom welcomed the smallest and most overlooked. There were also parables that carried a sharper edge, a vineyard owner sending servants to collect the harvest, only for them to be mistreated. A king inviting guests to a wedding banquet, only to have many refuse the place of honor, given instead to those from the streets. These stories unsettled some who realized they were being asked to see themselves in the mirror of his words. Yet even in the harder sayings, there was always the invitation. The kingdom was not a closed gate, but an open door for those willing to enter in humility and trust. He compared it to a net, let down into the lake, gathering fish of every kind, or to a shepherd, leaving 99 sheep to find the one that had wandered. Each image held the same truth that the kingdom sought: the lost, the overlooked, the ones who thought themselves outside its reach. As they walked from one village to another, the disciples carried these teachings in their minds, sometimes debating their meaning, sometimes simply holding them as seeds, yet to sprout. Jesus did not rush their understanding, just as he did not rush the growth of the kingdom itself. Both would come in, their time watered by patience and light. The kingdom he described was not bound by borders or guarded by walls. It was as near as the next act of mercy, as real as bread shared with the hungry, as enduring as love given without demand. It moved quietly like the wind, shaping the landscape without being seen, and those who lived in its ways found themselves part of something both as small as a seed and as vast as the sky. In the village of Bethany, just a short walk from Jerusalem, lived 3 siblings whose home became a place of welcome for Jesus. Whenever he passed through Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus, their house stood among olive trees, the air often carrying the scent of bread baking in the oven. Martha was the one who moved quickly, attending to the needs of guests with a practiced hand. Mary was slower to rise from her seat, her attention drawn more to conversation than to the tasks of hosting. Lazarus was quiet but steady, a friend whose presence brought ease. One day Jesus came to their home and Martha hurried to prepare a meal. The sound of bowls set on the table, the soft thud of bread on the board. Mary, however, sat at his feet, listening to his words. Her posture, as still as her sister's, was in motion. Martha paused in her work, long enough to speak. "Don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." Jesus answered gently, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." His voice held no rebuke, only the reminder that presence mattered more than perfection. Their friendship deepened over time, and it was in Bethany that Jesus received word of a sorrow. Lazarus was ill. Yet when he heard this, he stayed where he was for 2 more days, telling his disciples, "This illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." By the time they arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb 4 days. The house was filled with mourners, their voices low and heavy. Martha met Jesus on the road, her grief raw. "If you had been here, my brother would not have died," she said. "Yet even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." She answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." Mary came soon after, falling at his feet with the same words of grief. Jesus saw her weeping and those who had come with her, and he too was deeply moved. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. They led him to the tomb, a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. Martha hesitated. "Lord, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." But Jesus replied, "Did I not tell you that if you believe you will see the glory of God?" The stone was rolled away. Jesus looked up and prayed, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." Then he called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out," and the man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, his face covered with a cloth. Jesus said, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." In Bethany the air seemed lighter. That day grief turned into astonished joy, and the bond between Jesus and the 3 siblings became even stronger. Their home remained a place where he could rest, a reminder that friendship too was part of the work of the kingdom, and that in the presence of Jesus even death itself was not the end. The road from the Mount of Olives toward Jerusalem wound gently downward. The city spread out ahead, its walls catching the light of the morning sun. The air carried the mingled scents of olive groves and the dust of many feet. For the Passover was near, and pilgrims from every direction were making their way toward the temple. The streets would soon be crowded with voices from many lands. Jesus had been walking these roads for years, yet this day would be different. He sent 2 of his disciples ahead into a nearby village, telling them, "You will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it, and bring it here. If anyone asks, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord needs it. We'll send it back here shortly.'" They went and found it just as he had said, and when questioned gave the answer. He had given the owners, "Let them take it." They brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks over it as a makeshift saddle. Jesus mounted and began the short ride toward the city. The disciples walking beside him. People along the road spread their cloaks before him. Others cut branches from the fields and waved them in the air, laying some on the path. The sound of the crowd grew, voices rising with the words, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." The scene was both joyful and expectant, yet its nature was gentle. There were no banners of war, no armed guard, just the steady pace of the colt's hooves and the rustle of palm branches. The people saw in him a hope for deliverance, though their ideas of what that meant were not all the same. Looked for freedom from Rome. Others for a new kingdom, in the line of David. Still others simply felt drawn to the peace in his presence. As he drew closer to the city, the view opened wide, the Temple Mount rising in the heart of Jerusalem, the sun glinting off its stones. Jesus paused to look at the city and wept over it. "If you had only known on this day what would bring you peace. But now it is hidden from your eyes." His voice carried both sorrow and love, for he knew the path ahead would not match the cheers of this morning. Entering Jerusalem, he went to the temple and looked around at everything, the courts alive with the movement of people, animals, merchants, and pilgrims. But since it was already late, he left the city with the 12 and went to Bethany for the night. The day had ended without confrontation, but the step taken on that road had set in motion events that could not be turned back. For the disciples, the memory of that day was filled with light and sound, the warmth of the sun, the press of the crowd, the palm branches waving like green flames against the sky. They could not yet see the shadow that would soon fall across it all. For now there was only the image of Jesus riding calmly through the gates of the city, the voices of Hosanna still echoing against the stone walls as the city gathered him in. The temple courts were alive with motion that morning. The wide stone expanse filled with the voices of merchants calling out their wares. The clink of coins exchanged, the bleating of sheep, and the cooing of doves. Pilgrims from distant towns and far-off lands moved among the stalls, seeking what was needed for offerings. The air carried the scent of dust, mingled with the smell of animals and incense. The temple was meant to be a place of prayer, yet on this day it felt more like a market square. Jesus entered through the colonnades, his gaze moving over the scene. What he saw was more than trade. It was the burden placed on worshippers who had traveled far. Some charged unfair prices for sacrificial animals. Others profited from exchanging foreign coins for the temple currency. The noise of bargaining rose above the prayers. The space meant for all nations to seek God had become a place where the poor felt the weight of exclusion. Without hesitation, Jesus began to act. He overturned the tables of the money changers, coins scattering across the stones and rolling into the cracks. He pushed over the benches of those selling doves, the birds fluttering upward in a burst of wings. His voice carried across the court. "It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you are making it a den of robbers." The words echoed against the great walls, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Merchants scrambled to gather their goods, some protesting, others falling silent. The crowd pressed in to watch the sudden clearing. The animals were led out, the clamor fading until the court was left open. The sounds of footsteps and the low murmur of conversation returning to the space. Jesus stood in the center, his presence both commanding and calm. The air felt different, now lighter, the temple's vastness reclaiming its stillness. Those who had come to pray found themselves able to approach without the press of commerce. The sick and the blind came to him there, and he healed them. Children ran through the colonnades, their voices ringing out, "Hosanna to the Son of David." The chief priests and teachers of the law heard and were indignant, asking, "Do you hear what these children are saying?" "Yes," Jesus replied. "Have you never read, from the lips of children and infants? You, Lord, have called forth your praise." The clearing of the temple was not an act of anger alone. It was a restoration, a sign that worship was not to be weighed down by greed or guarded for the benefit of a few. It was to be open to all who sought the presence of God. The space itself became a living parable of the kingdom. He taught about a place where barriers were removed, and the overlooked could draw near. That night he left the city again, walking back to Bethany with his disciples. The streets quiet under the setting sun behind them. The temple stood in its usual place, yet those who had been there that day would not forget the sight of tables overturned, the sound of coins scattering, the words spoken with a clarity that cut through noise and tradition alike. For in that brief span of time, the heart of worship had been laid bare and the way into it made open once more. The streets of Jerusalem were heavy with the scents of roasting lamb and baking bread, the city alive with pilgrims gathered for Passover in an upstairs room, away from the noise of the crowds. Jesus and his disciples came together for a meal that would be unlike any they had shared before. He had sent Peter and John ahead with careful instructions to prepare the place. They found it, as he said, a large room furnished and ready. The table was low, cushions placed around it, the lamplight casting a warm glow on the walls outside. The evening was settling quietly over the city. Inside, the air was filled with the mingled smells of wine, herbs, and fresh bread. The disciples spoke in low voices as they took their places, unaware of how deeply the hours ahead would be etched into their memory. Before the meal began, Jesus did something unexpected. He rose from the table, removed his outer garment, and wrapped a towel around his waist. He poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. The dust of the city streets rinsed away one by one. Peter protested, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Still, Peter said, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus replied, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me then. Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." When he had finished, he put on his garment again and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." As they began to eat, Jesus' words grew more solemn. "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer, for I tell you I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." He took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." The weight of his words settled over them, some glancing at one another, uncertain. Then he said, "One of you will betray me." The room grew tense, each asking, "Is it I?" Lord Judas, who had already resolved to act, replied, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." Jesus answered quietly, You have said so, yet even in that moment he dipped bread and offered it to him, an act of hospitality given to one who would soon leave. The night deepened the city outside. Hushed except for distant voices, they sang a hymn together, their voices weaving into the stillness. Then Jesus led them out toward the Mount of Olives, the memory of the meal fresh in their minds. Bread broken, wine shared, the towel and basin set aside, the taste of the food mingled with the unspoken knowledge that something was drawing near. For the disciples, this was more than a Passover meal. It was a turning point. The familiar prayers and rituals, now infused with a new meaning, one they could not yet fully grasp. A covenant not written on stone, but sealed in the life of the one who had knelt to wash their feet, and who now walked ahead of them into the night. The night air was cool as they left the upper room, the narrow streets of Jerusalem giving way to the open slope of the Mount of Olives. Olive trees rose like dark silhouettes against the starlit sky, their twisted trunks holding centuries of silent witness. At the foot of the slope was a garden called Gethsemane, its name meaning oil press, a place where olives were crushed to release their essence. It was here that Jesus often came with his disciples to pray away from the city's noise. He told the group, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." Taking Peter, James, and John a little farther, his voice was low. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." He moved a short distance away and fell to the ground, his face to the earth. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." The words were not hurried, but heavy, each one shaped by the weight of what lay ahead. The garden was still, except for the sound of wind moving through the leaves, the cool earth beneath him carrying the scent of olives crushed underfoot. When he returned to his friends, he found them sleeping. "Could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away to pray, his words shifting farther. "If it is not possible for this cup to be taken away, unless I drink it, may your will be done." The quiet was broken. Only by his breathing, the nearness of God felt both intimate and vast when he returned. They were sleeping again, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. A third time he withdrew, repeating his prayer, and when he came back he said, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go, here comes my betrayer." The sound of footsteps approached, the glow of torches weaving through the trees, Judas leading the group, a kiss on the cheek, the signal agreed upon. The disciples stirred confusion, flashing into fear as soldiers stepped forward. Swords drawn, Peter drew his own sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Jesus said, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" He touched the servant's ear and healed him, even in that moment of arrest. The crowd bound him the ropes, rough against his wrists. The disciples scattered into the shadows, some watching from a distance as he was led away. The garden returned to its stillness, the wind moving through the olive branches, the ground holding the memory of his prayers pressed into its soil like the olives in the press nearby. For those who had been there, the night would be remembered, not only for the torches and the betrayal, but for the quiet hours before, when Jesus knelt in the cool darkness and chose surrender, not to defeat, but to the will that had shaped his every step. The garden would forever be a place where the weight of the world was met with the stillness of prayer. The glow of torches flickered against the olive trees, casting long, shifting shadows across the garden. The air held the smell of oil and dust, and the low murmur of voices as a crowd approached, led by Judas, one of the 12, his steps quick, his eyes searching for the one he had come to betray. Beside him were soldiers from the temple guard, their armor catching the light of the flames, the clink of metal mingling with the crunch of sandals on the earth. Jesus stood waiting, his hands free, his face calm though the moment was heavy with tension. Judas stepped forward and greeted him with a kiss, the sign he had arranged with those who came to seize him. "Greetings, Rabbi," Jesus asked. "Friend, do what you came for." The soldiers moved in, surrounding him, movements sharp and sure. The disciples reacted quickly, confusion spilling into action. Peter drew his sword, striking the servant of the high priest and cutting off his ear, but Jesus reached out and touched the man's ear, healing it in an instant. "Put your sword back in its place," he told Peter, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" He turned to the crowd. "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place, that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." His voice was steady, not in defiance, but in acceptance. The moment was not one of surprise for him, but of surrender to what he had long known would come. Then the disciples deserted him and fled, slipping into the shadows of the trees, their footsteps fading into the night. Jesus was bound, the rough rope biting into his wrists. The soldiers held him firmly as they began the walk back toward the city, the torches lighting their way through the darkness. Above them the stars still shone quietly, as if untouched by the turmoil below. The path to the high priest's house wound through narrow streets, the city quieter now, that the festival crowds were sleeping, but here and there a window glowed with lamplight, the sound of the group's passage echoing between the stone walls. Some who heard the noise peered out briefly before turning away. The guards kept their pace steady, the prisoner in their midst silent. At the high priest's courtyard, the gate was opened, and they led him inside. The chill of the night air, replaced by the heavy warmth of the fire burning in the center. The light flickered over the faces of those gathered guards, servants, officials, some curious, some hostile. Peter had followed at a distance, slipping into the courtyard to see what would happen, keeping to the edges of the firelight. In the garden the olive trees stood quiet again, the press of the moment replaced by the deep stillness of night. The ground where he had prayed now held the memory of footsteps and voices, the scent of oil lingering in the air for those who had been there. The arrest was not only the beginning of, and it was the moment when the teacher they had followed so closely was taken from their sight and placed in the hands of others. The road ahead would lead where none of them wished to go, yet it had begun here, under the torchlight among the shadows of Gethsemane. The courtyard of the high priest's house was dimly lit by a fire that burned in the center, its glow casting a circle of warmth into the cool night air. Beyond the light, the shadows of the surrounding walls seemed deeper. Peter lingered there, keeping his distance, yet close enough to see the movements. At the far end where Jesus was being questioned inside the hall, the murmur of voices rose and fell, carried on the night breeze. A servant girl noticed him, her eyes narrowing as she studied his face. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she said, her tone carrying both curiosity and accusation. Peter shifted under her gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, turning toward the gateway as if to step away from the circle of light. There another servant girl saw him and spoke to the bystanders. "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth again." Peter denied it this time, more firmly. "I don't know the man," the words leaving his mouth before he could think them through. His heart beating faster, the tension in the courtyard tightening like a rope drawn taut. A little while later, those standing nearby came to him. "Certainly you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." The Galilean cadence in his voice was unmistakable. Peter began to call down curses and swore, "I don't know the man," and at that moment the sound of a rooster crowing split the air clear and sharp above the low murmur of the courtyard. Peter froze, the memory of Jesus' earlier words flooding back. "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me." 3 times he turned his eyes toward the hall, and through the open doorway saw Jesus being led across the room for a moment. Their eyes met, no anger in Jesus' gaze, only a deep knowing, a steady grief that reached across the distance. Peter stumbled toward the gate and out into the street, the cold air striking his face. He found a dark corner away from the crowd and wept bitterly, the tears rising from the well of regret, each denial replaying in his mind his bold promises of loyalty, now hollow against the truth of his fear. He had wanted to stand beside his teacher, but when the moment came, he found himself shrinking from the fire's light, choosing safety over truth. In the courtyard, life went on. The fire crackled, voices murmured, guards shifted their weight, and the night moved steadily toward dawn. But for Peter, the sound of that rooster would never be just another morning. It would carry the weight of failure and the memory of eyes that met his compassion rather than condemnation. Yet even in this moment of collapse, the story was not over. Peter could not yet see the shoreline beyond this storm, or the way the same voice he had denied would one day call him again. Not in rebuke, but in restoration. For now there was only the night, the echo of the rooster's cry, and the quiet truth that sometimes the hardest part of following is not the leaving of nets, but the keeping of faith when the firelight shows your face. Morning light crept over Jerusalem. The narrow streets, stirring with the first movements of the day, merchants arranging their goods, travelers rising from their resting places. Yet within the walls of the governor's residence a different kind of gathering was taking place. Jesus was brought from the high priest's house, bound and weary, his steps steady, but slowed by the long night behind him. The chief priests and elders accompanied him, their purpose clear. They wanted a Roman sentence. Pontius Pilate, the governor, sat in judgment, a man accustomed to weighing accusations and reading the undercurrent of politics. He looked at Jesus with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked. Jesus replied, "You say so." The words neither defensive nor eager, just steady. The accusations came quickly from the leaders, but Jesus did not answer them. Pilate asked, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you yet?" Jesus remained silent, and the governor was amazed. Pilate sensed the tension of the moment. The crowd gathering outside the governor's courtyard was already restless. It was the custom during the Passover to release one prisoner chosen by the people at that time. There was a man called Barabbas, known for insurrection and violence. Pilate saw an opportunity. He stood before the crowd. "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas, or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" He knew it was out of envy that the leaders had handed Jesus over. But the chief priests moved among the crowd, urging them to call for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. When Pilate asked again, "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" they shouted back, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" Pilate asked. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." The cry rolling like a wave across the courtyard. Pilate felt the pressure mounting, the festival crowds, the volatile balance of order in the city, the leaders' determination. He called for water and washed his hands before them. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." The crowd answered, "His blood is on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas and handed Jesus over to be flogged and crucified. The soldiers took him into the praetorium, gathering the whole company around him. They stripped him of his clothes and draped a scarlet robe across his shoulders. They twisted together a crown of thorns, pressing it onto his head, placing a staff in his right hand. They knelt before him in mockery. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said, spitting on him and striking him with the staff. Then they led him away to be crucified. Outside the governor's residence, the city continued its daily motions. The clatter of market stalls, the call of merchants, the bleating of sheep for sacrifice. Few knew or understood the full weight of what had just been decided. For many it was just another day under Roman rule. For others, it was the moment they had demanded. For one man, it was the beginning of the end, and yet also the beginning of something far greater, though unseen. Pilate returned to his chambers, the shouts of the crowd still ringing faintly from the courtyard, his hands clean in ritual, but his heart perhaps heavier than before, for he had looked into the eyes of the prisoner and seen no threat, no malice, only a calm that seemed out of place in a man condemned. The road from the governor's residence wound out of the city toward a place called Golgotha, the place of the skull. The morning sun had risen higher. Now the streets lined with people, some drawn by curiosity, others by grief, and still others by the harsh satisfaction of seeing a sentence carried out. Jesus carried the crossbeam on his shoulders, its weight pressing into the torn flesh of his back. The soldiers walking beside him, keeping the crowd from pressing too close. As they moved through the narrow streets, he stumbled, the beam shifting against him. A man named Simon from Cyrene was pulled from the crowd and ordered to carry it. The two walked together under the strain, one from compulsion, the other from choice, but both bound in that moment toward the same hill. Women in the crowd wept for him. Jesus turned to them. "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." His words carrying both sorrow and prophecy. At Golgotha, the soldiers offered him wine mixed with gall, a bitter drink meant to dull the pain. He tasted it, but did not drink. They laid him on the crossbeam and drove the nails through his hands and feet, the sound of hammer on iron ringing out sharp against the morning air. The cross was lifted, set into place, his body hanging between earth and sky above his head. They fastened a sign reading "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. 2 criminals were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. The soldiers cast lots for his clothing, dividing what little he had. The crowd passed by, hurling insults. "He saved others, but he can't save himself," the religious leaders mocked. "Let him come down, now from the cross, and we will believe in him." Even the soldiers joined in their jeers. Yet from the cross came words that startled the air. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." One of the criminals beside him spoke with bitterness. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him. "We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." From noon until 3 darkness covered the land, the light dimming as if creation itself grieved at the 9th hour. Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some nearby thought he was calling for Elijah. Later he said, "I am thirsty," and they lifted a sponge, soaked in wine vinegar, to his lips. After receiving it, he said, "It is finished," and in a final breath, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Then he bowed his head and gave up his life. At that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split, and the centurion who stood watching said, "Surely he was the Son of God." The crowd began to disperse, the noise of the hill quieting into the low murmur of those who remained. Among them were women who had followed him from Galilee, Mary, his mother, Mary Magdalene, and others, their faces marked by grief, but their presence unbroken. The sky began to lighten again, though the air still felt heavy. The cross stood silent against the hill. The work of the soldiers complete, yet something unseen had taken place, something that would not remain hidden for long. As evening approached, the shadows lengthened across Golgotha. The crowd had thinned, leaving the hill quieter. Now the soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, taking down the bodies before the Sabbath began. Nearby stood a man named Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the council, who had not consented to the decision to condemn Jesus. He was a secret follower, yet in this moment he stepped forward with courage. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate, surprised at the request, confirmed through the centurion that Jesus was already dead. When permission was given, Joseph purchased a linen cloth, and together with Nicodemus, who brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, they took the body down from the cross, their hands steady but gentle. The scent of the spices rose in the cooling air. They wrapped the body in the linen, the folds smooth and careful, a final act of honor for one who had been stripped of dignity in his death. Nearby in a garden, Joseph owned a new tomb cut into the rock. No one had yet been laid there. They carried him along the quiet path, the stone walls of the tomb cool to the touch, the air inside holding the scent of fresh earth. They placed the body on the resting place within, and rolled a large stone across the entrance, sealing it from view, the heavy grind of stone against stone, marking the finality of the moment. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, followed to see where he was laid. Their steps slow, their faces lit only by the last light of day. They stood for a moment in silence, then turned back toward the city. The Sabbath drawing near, the streets were beginning to empty, the sounds of preparation in the homes contrasting sharply with the stillness of the garden behind them. Pilate ordered that the tomb be secured. The priests and Pharisees had come to him, remembering that Jesus had spoken of rising again after 3 days. They requested a guard to be placed at the tomb to prevent his disciples from taking the body. Pilate agreed. "Take a guard, go make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and sealed the stone and set the guard there, the flicker of their torches, the only movement in the darkened garden for the disciples. The hours that followed were heavy with confusion and grief. The one they had followed, the one they believed would bring the kingdom, was gone. Their minds replayed his words, yet they could not yet see their meaning. The Sabbath passed, in quiet, their movements limited by the law, thoughts restless under the stillness. In the garden the tomb remained closed, the stone unmoved, the guards keeping their watch, the spices and linen holding their scent in the darkness. Inside the earth seemed to wait. The olive trees swayed gently in the night air, their roots deep in the same soil that now cradled the one who had walked among them only days before. For those who had loved him, the burial felt like the end of the story yet. Unseen by them, the silence of the tomb was not empty. It was the pause before a word spoken, the stillness before a breath drawn. It was the waiting place, where heaven's work moved beyond the reach of human sight. The first light of dawn had barely touched the horizon when Mary Magdalene and the other women set out toward the tomb. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of dew on the olive trees. The city behind them still quiet, from the Sabbath rest in their hands. They carried spices prepared with care through the long hours of waiting, their steps quickened by devotion, yet slowed by the question that had been with them since they began: who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? As they reached the garden, the path narrowed, the shapes of the guards and the sealed stone came into view. But something was different. The stone had been rolled away, not to the side in disarray, but moved cleanly from its place. The opening dark and still, they hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. The air seemed to shift as they entered the tomb. Inside they saw not the body they had come to anoint, but a young man dressed in white, sitting on the right side, his face calm and bright. "Do not be afraid," he said. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples, and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." The women's hearts pounded their hands, trembling as they looked at the empty place where the body had been. The linen cloths lying there, the scent of spices now mingled with the cool air of the tomb. They hurried from the garden, fear and joy woven tightly together, the world around them, unchanged, yet entirely different. The olive branches swayed the same, the path lay before them, as it had before, yet every step now carried the weight of the angel's words. Later that morning, Mary Magdalene returned to the tomb, unable to stay away. She stood outside weeping, then bent to look inside again. She saw two angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. "Woman, why are you crying?" they asked. "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." Turning around, she saw a man standing there, though she did not recognize him. "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener. She said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary," her name spoken in the voice. She knew at once. She turned toward him and cried out, "Rabboni," which means teacher. "Do not hold on to me," he said, "for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them what he had said to her. In the garden the morning light grew warmer, the air filled with birdsong, the stone still rolled away, the tomb still empty. The world had entered a new day, though many did not yet know it. The silence of the grave had been broken, not with the trumpet of kings or the march of armies, but with a voice calling a name, and the answering cry of joy from one who loved him. The day of the resurrection was not quiet for long. Word moved quickly among the disciples, though it came in fragments carried by different voices. Some spoke of the women's report, others of the empty tomb, still others of strange encounters. None could yet grasp the whole picture. Two of them, Cleopas and another, set out from Jerusalem toward a village called Emmaus. About 7 miles away, the road stretched before them in the soft light of afternoon, their conversation heavy with all that had happened. A stranger joined them, walking at their pace. "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" he asked. Their faces reflected the weight of their grief. "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he said. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. They told of his crucifixion." Their hopes dashed then of the women's story of the empty tomb and angels, but they could not believe it. "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. When they reached the village, they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening." He agreed. And when they sat at the table, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They rose at once and returned to Jerusalem, hearts burning within them. That evening the disciples were gathered behind locked doors for fear of the authorities. The room was dim, the only light from the oil lamps, when suddenly Jesus stood among them. "Peace be with you," he said. They were startled, thinking they saw a ghost. But he showed them his hands and his side and said, "Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see. I have." He ate a piece of broiled fish before them, not out of hunger alone, but as a sign of the reality of his presence. 8 days later he appeared again, this time with Thomas present, who had said, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, and my hand into his side, I will not believe." Jesus invited him. "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas fell to his knees. "My Lord and my God," Jesus said, "because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." On another day, by the Sea of Galilee, the disciples had returned to fishing, working through the night and catching nothing. At dawn, a figure stood on the shore, calling, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" When they answered, "No," he said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." They did, and the net filled so full they could barely haul it in. John whispered to Peter, "It is the Lord." Peter plunged into the water and swam to shore. There they found a fire with fish on it and bread. Jesus said, "Come and have breakfast." In these moments, scattered across days and places, the disciples came to see that the resurrection was not a single instant, but a living presence that met them on roads, in locked rooms, by familiar waters, each appearance weaving certainty into their hearts that he was alive and that nothing would be the same again. The days after the resurrection carried a sense of both wonder and waiting. The disciples knew now that Jesus was alive, yet they did not fully know what would come next. They gathered, often some in Jerusalem, some in Galilee, speaking of his appearances, remembering his words, and finding them drawn together as if the bonds between them had deepened beyond the reach of fear. One morning in Galilee they went to a mountain where Jesus had told them to meet. The climb was familiar, yet their hearts beat faster as they drew near. At the summit, the air was clear, the sky wide above them. And there he stood. They worshipped him, though some still held quiet doubts, not of his presence, but of what it all might mean. Jesus came closer and spoke, his voice steady, carrying both authority and tenderness. "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." His words reached beyond the circle gathered there, beyond the mountains and valleys. They could see beyond the borders of their homeland. They were being sent not to remain in the safety of familiar shores, but to carry the news of what they had seen and heard to every people, every language, corner of the earth. The message was not one of conquest, but of invitation. A kingdom not built by the sword, but by the seed of the word, planted in hearts. Some may have wondered how fishermen and tax collectors could speak to nations, how those who had once hidden behind locked doors could stand in the marketplaces of distant cities. Yet in his presence the task felt possible. The promise that he would be with them always was not a vague comfort, but living truth they had already experienced in the breaking of bread on the road, the sudden voice in the locked room, the warmth of a fire by the sea. He reminded them of the heart of his teaching. Love one another as I have loved you. Forgive as you have been forgiven. Show mercy to the stranger. Care for the least among you. Live in such a way that others see the light of the kingdom in you. The commission was as much about how they would go as where they would go, their lives themselves becoming a testimony. From that mountain they descended, carrying his words like a flame sheltered in their hands. The road ahead would lead them to places they could not yet imagine. Some to distant lands, some to the heart of the city, some into trials that would test the limits of their courage. Yet none of them would walk it alone. They would remember the feel of the wind on that mountain, the weight of his gaze, the certainty of his promise. For now they returned to the city as he had told them to wait there until they were clothed with power from on high. The days between were filled with prayer and with the quiet anticipation that the story which had begun in small villages and fishing boats was about to step out into the wide world. The years that followed the mountain in Galilee saw the disciples carry the message of Jesus far beyond the borders of their homeland. They walked roads built by the Roman Empire, sailed across waters to distant ports, spoke in marketplaces under open skies and in quiet homes, their voices telling the story of the one who had walked with them, healed the broken, fed the hungry, and risen from the grave. Each telling was shaped by the place and the people who heard it, yet at the heart, the message was the same. In Jerusalem, Peter stood before crowds in the temple courts, speaking with the boldness of one restored, the fisherman who had once denied his teacher, now proclaiming him openly. Thousands believed and were baptized, their lives marked by a new way of living, sharing possessions, meeting daily in prayer, breaking bread together. The first seeds of what would become the church were planted in those days. Paul, who had once opposed the followers of Jesus, became one of the most tireless in carrying his name to the Gentile world, traveling to cities across Asia Minor and Greece, writing letters to encourage and guide communities of believers. Those letters would be read and copied long after the ink had dried, their words shaping faith across centuries through persecution and hardship. The story spread, not by force but by witness, ordinary men and women living with a hope that could not be silenced. They cared for the sick in times of plague, rescued abandoned children, welcomed strangers into their homes, and in doing so reflected the love they had received in Christ. Over time, the message reached new continents, carried along trade routes, and across oceans, translated into countless languages, painted into art, carved into stone, sung in cathedrals, whispered in secret gatherings where it was not safe to speak his name. It inspired acts of mercy and movements for justice. It shaped laws and stirred the hearts of poets and musicians. It became the center of prayer for the solitary monk and the guiding light for families in humble homes. The figure of Jesus himself remained both deeply personal and vast in influence for some. He was the gentle shepherd leading them through the shadows for others, the teacher whose words challenged their comfort. For still others, the Redeemer whose sacrifice offered freedom from guilt and fear. Image could be found in stained glass, and in the memory of bread shared at a simple table, in the quiet conviction of a heart turned toward forgiveness. Centuries turned and empires rose and fell, yet his story endured not because of the power of those empires, but because it had taken root in the lives of the ordinary. It could be told without books or temples, without wealth or armies. It could be carried in memory and spoken in a single breath. Jesus is Lord, and it could take shape in countless expressions of love. Today, his influence is woven into the fabric of cultures around the world, even among those who do not follow his teaching. His words are quoted, his example admired, his life studied. His story continues to invite reflection on what it means to love one's neighbor, to seek peace, to live with humility and courage in the face of hardship. For those who believe his promise to be with them always, the story is not only history but present reality. The same voice that called fishermen by the shore still calls hearts in quiet moments. The same hands that broke bread still reach through acts of kindness. The same Spirit that sent disciples into the world still moves across continents and generations. And so the life of Jesus of Nazareth, which began in a small village, under a night sky, continues to move like a river through time, shaping the land it touches, flowing toward a horizon where every tear is wiped away and every wrong made right, a legacy not carved in stone alone, but written in lives, transformed one by one.